everyone, and a very warm welcome back to Beaglington-On-Sea. Yes, hello everyone, it's October now, and a very warm welcome, as I said, back to Beaglington-On-Sea, or should I say Beaglington Mk3. Things have certainly progressed here over the last couple of months. And so this episode we're going to look about how I got the frames sorted out and also the flap over there. So first of all, I have to say a massive thank you to John, who helped by giving up his time and his van to help me build this railway. He spent a number of days around my house helping me sort out the frames and the wood and everything, and I couldn't have done it without him. So a big thank you to John. And so we're going to start off with basically at the end of the last episode, as you saw, the old Beaglington is gone. It's out in the shed. So it was time to get the materials and crack on with getting the frame built. So I'll hand over to myself narrating.
So the first thing to do was get some MDF and some timber, which we put into John's van and brought back to the house, where we cleared space to start building at least one side of the railway.
As you can see, the position of Alex's desk has changed, and we moved the units out to put the wood over here. So the new baseboards going to go.
Now my measurements were all pretty much accurate and correct. The trouble was that whoever had built the room did not do this evenly. The walls seemed to undulate in every direction. The walls either side of the window, the rear window that was, were both angled climbing away at either side, which made the battening that went across the window quite difficult to do. And at the end wall of the house, it was difficult to screw the battens to the wall because the wall was just like sponge cake. The next job was to cut up the MDF into the right board sizes. Here you can see some of them over the top of the desk, and then we started work on the frames. And we worked out where the legs would go based on where the storage units would go underneath. Starting to come together, and you could kind of get an idea about what it was going to look like. And Smukbus, the railway inspector, turned up to see how the foundations were coming together, and I had the hiccups. And with the first board laid out, I had the track set up to see what the station was going to be like, what the length was like with Beaglington all stretched out, and I was just amazed at how good it looked, how much longer it looked, how much, even though it was narrower, how much more space there seemed, and to be able to have proper length trains on the straight. So obviously I set up the Flying Scotsman. And so with that side done, it was time to work on the other long side, the other side of the room, although all the sides are the same length. And that did require moving the tomato plant from beyond Beaglington. And this board actually sits at a lower height by about 10 centimeters to the rest of the boards. Now, one problem we found especially with this corner is just how unsquare the corner was. and this required a bit of extra measuring and a bit of extra cutting and figuring out how we were going to slot the board in to get it to fit into the corner, because the corner's really that bad. And here's me doing my Nick Knowles DIY SOS impression. Soon it was time to turn our attention to the section across the desk and over towards the flap, and as this sits higher than the next board, we were able to use the other board to support it slightly and then have a leg to support it over by the door. The next most difficult thing, and one of the most difficult things of the whole build, was the flap, to get trains across from one side of the door to the other. So John designed this triangular bracket, and we had to kind of keep adjusting it to make sure that it was level, so the board would keep level going and allow the track to pass on the level. And so the boards really did seem to be coming together quite well. We fitted 2 hinges, although one had to be cut short to enable trains to be able to fit between them, to the door flap, and here is it open and shut. And at last, despite the difficulty with putting the battens on the final wall due to its sponginess, we had all the boards done. And really now you could get a sense of the scale of this layout, and also how much space has been saved by putting it over the tops of the storage things and removing the old railway taking up all that space in the middle of the room. And after a busy day inspecting the boards, Smutpuss went for a nap.
So yes, that was the frame sorted out, and I have to say it's pretty robust. So yeah, it's quite a good height really for working on. And it's got enough space underneath for me to have the storage things and things stored on top of those, so that's been quite helpful. So I will run some trains after the next scene, but basically the track is laid down at the moment. I've only just got enough track to do the 2 outside lines, and I still haven't got all of the track I need for that, and there's a lot of just random pieces to sort of fit it in. And where it's going over, where the bridge is going to go, it's all a bit up and down, so it's just a bit unsupported MDF really. So I will try and run some trains at the end, just through the Beaglington section, and hopefully they'll work. So yes, on to sorting out the flap.
And with those hinges secured and the Smutpuss sat in the sun, it was time to check on the clearances using the Hornby Bill, who's rather large. So I was just checking to make sure he passed by the hinges, and there'd be plenty of clearance because, you know, like I said, he's rather wide. So that didn't seem to be a problem. And then I had the Caledonian GWR coach that my friend Larry got me, and tested that through because that is like quite a long wheelbase, or rather long chassised coach. So I was just testing to see there wasn't too much overhang that was going to bump into the hinge blocks, but that all seemed to go quite well. Having tested the clearances, I decided to mark out the sleepers that I was going to have to draw around, because I was going to cut those sleepers off and solder the rails to brass screws screwed into the baseboards, as I'd seen done by that one railway guy. So for my birthday I got a new Ferrex rotary tool. I'd never used one of these rotary tools before, and it had a drill bit, and having marked out where the sleepers were going to go, I drilled some holes ready to take some brass screws. So drilling the holes went quite well. Having hoovered away the excess, I then proceeded to screw in the first of the brass screws. This seemed to be quite stubborn and didn't really want to go into the wood despite having pre-drilled the hole. So the screw just didn't seem to want to go into the board, and after further drilling out the holes that I'd already drilled for future screws, and then taking the screw out and then drilling out the hole and trying to put it back in, I just couldn't seem to get it to sit down into the wood where it needed to be. And quite frankly, by this point I'd had enough, and I really did not think I could do what I planned to do. So as the sun started to set and the cats sat upon the shed outside the garden, I decided to call it a day. So with a new day and fresh eyes, I decided to line the track up where it needed to be and make sure I had the right sleeper cut off of the track, and reverted to something I knew I could do: hot glue. Having hot glued the track firmly enough in place, it was now time to cut the rails. Using the rotary disc attachment for the Ferrex rotary tool, I very carefully cut the rails exactly where they needed to be cut over the baseboard joint. These spinning discs are quite fragile, but spun at high speed, they can cut through rail. Having cut the first two rails on the outside line, or the wall side line, I gave it a quick test with a Dapol wagon, a limited edition Mid-Suffolk Light Railway Museum wagon of Melanie Ipswich, I think it was, because it has very fine axles, to see whether that will pass over the baseboard joint fine without any derailing. Having checked that the wagon would pass over the rails perfectly fine, it was time to cut the next two rails. And it's highly recommended that you wear eyewear when doing this sort of thing, because obviously there are materials being kicked out by the disc, and you might even want mouth protection if you're doing something where it's going to be particularly dusty. So just bear that in mind when you're using these tools. And of course, use the same wagon again just to check that it was working perfectly fine. With the first joints thoroughly tested, it was time to hot glue down the rest of the track. And then once the glue had set, obviously it would be time to cut the rails. And this was going to be a more difficult part because this was the last chance to make sure that everything was going to be perfect. So when the glue was set, I took out the disc and I cut the rails and then retested it with the same wagon as well, and just had to shave a little bit off one of the rails in order to make sure that everything was working fine. With the rail joints tested and the glue set in place, it was time to drill some holes so that I could pass wires from under the board to under the flap that would connect the track on either side and thus be able to pass electricity over to the rails on the flap, because obviously they weren't touching the rest of the track at either end and thus were not passing on any electricity to that section. I then drilled holes in the main board as well, so that the wires could come back up and connect to the rails on that side. With all the holes drilled, it was time to hoover off the excess dust that had come from drilling the holes. And then I found that actually one of the holes was drilled in the wrong place because of where the timber was supporting the flap, so I had to drill a new hole on one of the lines. Having drilled the holes, I then fitted the wires that would need to be soldered to the rails, with red to the rear of the layout and black to the front, and making sure to get this right for both of the lines. Then I tested the flap to see if it would work with the wires hanging down. The next job was to properly tin the wires before trying to solder them to the track. One of the jobs I'm not very good at is soldering, and another job I'm even worse at is soldering things to the track. Soldering is an incredibly fiddly job, and I highly recommend using a pair of tweezers. I usually do this to hold the solder. I should have done this to hold the wires. It's also quite dangerous because you're using quite a hot implement, and so you should probably wear heat resistant gloves, unlike me, in which case this can happen.
Ow, 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 ow.
Trying to solder to the side of smooth rails is quite difficult. I had kind of scratched up a little bit of the surface to try and give it more of a surface to cling to, but it just seemed to take ages to try and get it to work correctly. Like I said, I'm just not that good at soldering. But eventually, I managed to get the wires soldered to the rails. And with the soldering done, it was time to test out whether it actually works. So I let Bill test it out. Having got Bill passed over the board with a bit of power, I decided I would try and test out a train for a little bit. So I chose to put together a long train of various different types of private owner wagon, because they normally end up coming off the rails at some point anyways, pulled by Alton Hall, which I know is a reliable runner, and tried to get it to pass over the bridge and back towards the station area. I had cobbled together enough track to make one loop round the room on the line that the hall is travelling on, but not the inside line, so it's not properly connected up that line. So I tried to get it to work, but because of the various connection issues, even after passing over the bridge, the train would just keep stopping. So it took a while to be able to get Alton to actually go over the bridge properly, but there were no problems. Things just happened to go straight over the joints on either side, and I didn't have to worry at all. Something I'd done had actually turned out all right. And despite a few problems stopping on the curves due to connection issues, I was now able to run the train round the room continuously.
So yes, that was the flap sorted, and my fingers recovered from soldering, and I couldn't test it properly because I didn't have all the track, but I do now have enough track to actually run things over, and they have been thoroughly run in. So I've got trains set up. I'm going to run some trains through the Beaglington section and let you see how they kind of look going through this sort of space. And of course, Smookpuss is here with me. He's just over there on the window. Hello, Smookpuss. Right, so I'm going to run some trains now. I've got a High-Mech D7046 in BR two-tone green with some blue and grey coaches. I've cleaned the wheels on this now, and it runs much better. Power still drops out a little bit, but it runs a lot smoother, so I don't have the same kind of problems I had on the previous Beaglington-On-Sea. And then on the other main line, or the other way, I have a double R1 with some malachite suburban coaches, so we're going to get some footage of things running around now. we're going to stop the Heimlich there in the station. And yeah, once decided to stop. There we go. So let's get back to the station now. There, nice to have some trains running again. So thank you very much for watching, and next time hopefully we'll have some more progress. So thank you to everyone who likes, comments, shares and subscribes, and thank you for sticking with the channel. And we hope to see you again here in Beaglington-On-Sea and with Beaglington Mk3. And yeah, hopefully we'll have a bit more footage of trains running next time, hopefully. So until then, goodbye. Right, come on, Smush. Oh, and don't forget there's also the subscribe button with the playlist thing. So, ta-ra.